So that's just kind of playing through a bunch of stuff, and I never really play to perform. I'm always practicing. So in some ways, I feel bad for the audience sometimes because it's my workshop. when I'm on the stage with whatever it is, and it depends on what mood you're in and what you're working on one song and then you're working on something else for the other song and that kind of stuff. But I played a bunch of different things just to sort of walk through a lot of the stylistic things that we have to deal with in Miami in particular. When you live in any region that is culturally very diverse, musically very diverse, you end up getting thrust into places where you can feel really uncomfortable. If you're, I grew up kind of listening to Spanish music, like Spanish opera, which is called Tafuela, and a lot of kind of easy listening orchestral music like Mantovani and things like that. My introduction to jazz was at about 19. I played some in high school, but I had no idea. I had never really heard Coltrane. I think I heard Giant Steps. I was maybe 17 or 18 the first time and didn't get it. I still don't get it. But I grew up in an era where as a young kid, we weren't wealthy by any means, so we were pretty poor, and so I worked. And I always had kind of a natural sound about playing the saxophone. I could always play the saxophone, and not that I played it well, but I could play it. And so I was doing a lot of work, and I was playing with bands that were playing all kinds of music. And my introduction to bossa novas was on the bandstand. My introduction to real Latin music. I come from Spain. My family is, I was born in Venezuela, but I come from Spain. So my introduction to real kind of Latin music happened on the bandstand. It didn't happen in class, didn't happen in school. And so over time, I have certain things that I really love. Like I'm a huge fan of King Curtis, and I'm a huge fan of Dave Sanborn's and Tom Scott and Mike Brecker and Junior Walker and those guys. I love that music. I grew up listening to Earth, Wind and Fire in Chicago and Kiss and Queen, and so I just like music. I've never been I always laugh about the jazz police. There's a lot of people who are, well, do you play jazz? I'm like, I play whatever the hell I want. And, people talk about, downbeat. It's like, I'm from Venezuela, man. I'm worried about the syncopations. I couldn't care less about downbeats. All that kind of stuff. I'm pretty irreverent in that respect. But my job is to play on. One day I'll get called and I'll be on a Rihanna record. I work with George Clinton, who's the father of funk, and I played on a lot of records by that point. And so I walk in, and I look like this, and George couldn't care less. It wasn't like, you don't look the part. I've heard you play, so I know you can do this, and it's fun. And so I'm in that environment. I'm working with Two Live Crew one day and doing that, and having Phil Ramone called me. I was recording something at the Hit Factory and at the Criteria, and there's a phone call. I'm doing a solo for somebody, and the engineer comes in and he says, Mr. Carter, there's a phone call, the assistant, because all the engineers call me Ed, but the assistant is a young kid. There's a phone call for you. I'm like, I'm right in the middle of a recording session. It's Phil Ramone. And so the engineer laughs. I said, yeah, okay, I'll go take it. So I go pick up the phone, and I got my saxophone on my thing, and Phil says, what are you doing about 4:30? Like, what do you need me to do? I said, I need you to come down and play a solo for Frank. I'm like, which Frank? There's that one. I'm like, okay. So I'm like in the middle of a rock and roll date at the Hit Factory, and 20 minutes later, or an hour later, I'm down doing a solo for Frank Sinatra, and they're in the booth, and Phil says you know that Stan Getz thing, the airy thing? I'm like, yeah. He goes, can you do that for him? Yeah. And so then he says, do me a favor, can you play a little on top of the beat? Yeah. Can you play a little behind the beat? Yeah. And about at this point, I'm feeling like it's a final exam, And they're all in there laughing. And I'm thinking like, well, I must be really screwing up. So I said, is everything okay? And Phil goes, yeah, I just wanted to show them the things that you do. And so then we go and play the solo on the thing. So my life has been really good in that respect. I've had the great fortune I got to record with Tom Dowd, who actually was the recording engineer on Giant Steps. He recorded Giant Steps. He also produced Eddie Money and a lot of other records. And he's also one of the guys who built the atomic bomb. He was on the Manhattan Project. So I was in there with Greg Allman the first time I went to work with him. And Tom calls me in and he says, hey, that growl thing? The King Curtis thing and the growl? So I said, yes. ridiculous. Can you do that? And I'm like, he's like, yeah. And so Greg Allman has this smile on his face, you know, and so we do these solo and all that kind of stuff. And then when we're done, I start talking to Tom, and he's I don't know if you guys know who he is, but he's one of the fathers of engineering, of recording engineering. He's one of the guys who did everything. But he's actually the engineer on Giant Steps on that album. And so I'm sitting here, and I'm a math geek, you know, so I said to Tom, I said, so what was it like working on the Manhattan Project? And you have to picture, there's this studio, you know, a couple $100 an hour, and there's Greg Allman, and there's all these heavy people, and all these producers, and everybody's looking at each other going like, what are these people talking about? And he walked me through the whole thing. He walked me through about how, you know, he was a nuclear physicist, and he decided to go into, got drafted into the project, and he was there for the bomb test, and he lost part of his upper end hearing, so how he had to, like, make up for that when he was doing mixes and stuff like that, and it was like what it was like recording Coltrane. And, you know, I'm like, and he recorded King Curtis, recorded everybody else. So my life's been really good. And so for that reason, I don't play just one kind of music. I play a lot of different things, and I have fun doing it. But because this is a saxophone thing, you know, you get nervous playing for saxophone players because we're the worst. So, and sorry, I'm fighting reeds, and you know, it takes a second to get used to whatever it is. But it's a great horn. I mean, it plays freaking ridiculous. I can't play, but the horn plays great. And the mouthpiece is different. I've been playing, I played Jody's stuff for a long time, and I've been playing this Link that I've had for a long time. And so lately I've been playing that. Eric's working with me to come up with something that's kind of what I do, because I do so many weird things. You guys heard that band PALO? You guys know about that band? There's a band called PALO. It's PALO. And there are a lot of videos on the internet and a lot of records. I'm sorry I didn't bring the records, but of all the things that I do, that has to be probably the most insane. I mean, there's some stuff on those records that when I listen back to it, I start laughing, thinking, how did anybody let me get away with it, first of all? And second, what the hell was I on when I did it? But there, you know, all these things like 3-octave skips and lines and these crazy merengues, and then the next thing you're playing. So I have a lot of fun doing all that kind of stuff, and it just keeps you, I think it keeps you honest and it keeps you fresh. So I'll be playing with Arturo Sandoval and doing kind of that real traditional thing or the Latin thing, and then turning around and doing something else. But because it's saxophone players, I thought I would just open it up to questions. And I think you heard on the two sides of those solos how the approaches were very different. And so a couple of things that I thought we could talk about today. Eric asked me something about practicing, you know, and I went to the University of Miami, and I sort of got lucky in that I figured out something about practicing, because I still do. I'm still working on everything, and you know, I'm never happy with what I play. It's hard for me to listen to myself, but I found out that the best tool for practicing was I kept a journal. I kept this little book, and I have it at home, but I practiced like 14, 15, 16 hours a day, every day. Sometimes I'd take Sundays off, but it was always there. But I had this thing where on the instrument, and I started from literally from zero because I had never really heard jazz. So let's say that I was working on some kind of a scale. I never practiced without a metronome, and I never practiced without a tape recorder. And I had this journal, and what I did was I would list, like on Monday, let's say, that I had to play a scale. And I'll show you a couple of things that are really cool, and we'll get into a discussion about. How many of you studied geometry in school? Remember that the triangle has 180 degrees, right? Well, what if I told you that that's complete horse crap? It's horse crap. I mean, that's one triangle. It turns out that Euclid said that you know, two lines cut by a transversal whose alternate interior angles are congruent never touch. So along came a group of mathematicians and said, well, what if parallel lines do touch? Because you can't prove that postulate. It can't be proven. We don't know if it's real or not. So these guys come along and they developed non-Euclidean geometry. And it turns out that non-Euclidean geometry is exactly as rigorous and exactly as provable and exactly as consistent as everything else. And without it, In fact, space and time are curved, and Hilbert and those guys did us a huge favor, and it turns out that without it, we wouldn't have the theory of relativity, and Einstein and everything else. In music, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, the triangle is 180 degrees, and it's the major scale, and it's the mode, and it's the pentatonic, and it's the minor pentatonic. And I love my friends, and I have great respect for them, and they're all full of crap. Do me a favor, play a B flat minor chord for me, minor 7. Most people would say that this is the minor pentatonic scale. No. That's the D flat concert major pentatonic scale in 5th position. But what happens to or we have been told a bunch of stuff that limits everybody to these ridiculous places. And then people come along and study the Slimsky book like Coltrane or Michael or somebody like that comes along, Debussy or other people, and all of a sudden they do something and everybody's like, genius. Yeah, it's genius in the sense that they said, hey man, that isn't the only way to, there is a non-Euclidean universe. That's the one we live in. It isn't all 180 degrees. And so for me, one of the things I learned, for example, if I wanted to learn a scale, and I'll show you, I do a lot of these things. Michael Brecker said something to me that I never forget. We were friends, and we used to talk about things. And he asked me one day, he said, do me a favor, play a B flat major 7 sharp 5 chord. Anybody know what scale we play on that thing? You know. Melodic minor from the 6th. The reason for that is that every note in that scale works. And now melodic minor, if we go to conservatory, right, the classical people, the one that stick their finger out and they've been listening to music that's been decomposing longer than they were composing it, they're going to argue with me about, melodic is, look, in jazz, we don't have time to change it on the way down. We got to get to the next chord, dude. So whatever it is going up, it's the same way going down. The classical guys, I just have this thing, yeah, man, it's great. And then I walk away and go, and Bach and Beethoven would be cracking up. They'd be like, yeah, follow that fat guy. I like him. Because they were doing all the same stuff. They'd say, well, we're doing this, and then they'd break every rule. And thank God nobody caught them, or they would have burned them at the stake, right? But so here's... It turns out that all these chord scales, what they really mean is that you take all the notes in the chord and you just kind of, how we bounce, skip a note, and we just take them all and we put the blocks back together and we turn them into chord scales. So Michael Brecker says to me, he says, we're recording this record, he says, what do you play on the major 7 sharp 5 chord? And I look at him with his face like, melodic minor from the 6th. He goes, yeah, that's what I play. I said, where the hell do you think I learned it? and so he's cracking up, and Patitucci says to me, he says, how come he talks to you about harmony and not to us? I said, because I'm from Venezuela and we don't have harmony there. But Michael said to me that day, he said, the day I learned melodic minor, it changed my life. I always thought about that, and then I realized something about melodic minor. And for example, in that scale, there's a major pentatonic where the 6 is flattered. Now, pentatonic scales are interesting because they're really just fifths, right? But they're always perfect fifths. But in nature, nothing's perfect all the time. There's a lot of look at me in the mirror. Or there's what I call the Aeolian pentatonic. did something funky, and all you really did was you applied the idea that we don't live in this kind of diatonic world, that we don't live in Ionian, that we live in all of them. And that why do we limit ourselves? So for example, when I'm practicing, let's say that I wanted to learn that major flat six pentatonic, which is it's one of the modes, one of the pentatonic modes of melodic minor. Well, some of them are going to lay really well on the saxophone, right? And some of them are not going to lay so well. In my case, none of them lay very well. So what I would do is I would find the one that was the worst, which was all of them, but whichever one was the worst. And I would find the tempo that I could play that one out on Monday. And then I would practice all of them at that tempo with a metronome. On Tuesday, I would move that metronome click, depending on the difficulty of the topic involved, 2 ticks, 4 ticks, 8 ticks, but always making sure that the worst one was perfect, because all the other ones were going to come in line. Well, when you think about that, if you just take Monday through Friday, and you take, because you hear Coltrane play, and aspiring to do that, none of us are ever going to do that, but we're going to get pretty good at doing it. Like, we're going to play and people aren't going to leave usually, so it's going to be pretty good. But we want to improve some stuff. We want to learn how to play faster. We want to learn how to do certain things. So I had this thing where I was moving the ticks up by 2s or by 4s or whatever. But when you think about a summer and you think about a 3-month period, if you're moving the metronome 10 ticks a week, they're moving 40 ticks a month. That means in one summer, that metronome has moved 120 ticks. You went from 60 to 180. In some cases, you're moving that metronome marking 4, 6, 8, 10 ticks a day, which means that at a 3-month pace, when you're done and you look back and you listen to yourself play, you realize you're not the same musician. And you can measure exactly how much better it got. This concept that somehow we're going to practice something on a Wednesday and it's going to be okay 2 weeks from now doesn't work. So I had this very rigorous routine with all of the scales, with all of the patterns, things like thirds, things like fourths, things like fifths and sixths. I was really psychotic. I still am to that stuff. But doing that. And with that, I would have like certain patterns, like there's some great books, the David Baker books, may rest in peace, which have some great, especially for a kid like me from Venezuela who didn't understand bebop, had never played it, had never really heard it. So it was my introduction to some of that vocabulary. And I would learn that stuff in 12 keys. And Eric and I were talking about that. So that's one thing. And the other thing was that I never practiced without a metronome and a tape recorder. Because the two things that will never lie to you are the metronome and the tape recorder. Everything else will lie to you, including ourselves. We'll play something, well, that's terrible, and then you hear it back and you're like, that wasn't horrible. Or you'll play something and you think, that was great, and then you hear it back and you're like, that was horrible. So they never lied. So I had this little setup. This was way back in the dinosaur days, but I had like 2 tape recorders, and I went to Radio Shack and I bought all these Y cables, not knowing anything about anything. I'm like, I'm just going to plug this into this and this into this, and I'm going to make this go in it. And sure enough, and then what I did was I would record everything that I was playing, like the Aebersold records. I would play on a tune with the Aebersold record. But the key was that as soon as I was done, I had to drive home, I had to drive to school, and I had to drive to a gig. The whole time that I was in college, I never knew that there was AM or FM. I didn't know that there was sports talk. I didn't know the news was on. All I did was listen to what I had practiced that day, and then usually the comment was, well, that sucked. And then I would sort of try to fix it. I would hear things like, for example, that note is always weird, or I always breathe in this particular place in the phrase, or why do I always play this particular thing and man, I can't tell you, it was very depressing. Any of you listening to yourselves play and you're like really miserable about it all the time? How many of you go through that? Yeah. I remember being with Brecker and him saying like, yeah, it wasn't so good. And you just want to spank them. And Sam one, same thing. It's like, yeah, that wasn't, and you're like, yeah, okay, that wasn't so good. But it's just, we're all that way. But you're your own best critic. You're your own best teacher because you know what you want it to sound like. And so that part of it had really helped me. So I hope that those things are things that you guys can use. And don't ever pick up phone calls from percussionists because they're insane. But any questions about that? Does that help anybody? Anybody here working on practicing? And by the way, it's not about time. And I'll tell you something else. For those of us who are older than 20, we learn faster when we're older than we do when we're younger. I got my doctorate at 50. I learned how I learn, and I learned how to learn. I learned much faster as I got older than I did when I was younger. Finished a math degree while I was on middle of a tour. I got fed up with it, and I went to finish all these math courses. And in fact, I went to do the record with Arturo and Chick Corea and stuff. I was in the middle of calculus 3 and number theory and all this stuff, and I had to go to the professor. I didn't tell him who I was. I went to the professor. I said, listen, I want to take the final early because I have to go to New York and I have to do something. He says, what do you have to do that's so important? He said, I have to go play on a record with Chick Corea and Dave Weppel and Arturo Sandoval. And he looked at me and goes, what? And he looked at my name, and my real name is Eduardo. So he looks at Eduardo Calle, he goes, Ed, are you the saxophone player guy? Like, why didn't you tell me? I said, because if I told you, nobody would take me seriously. You know, they figure it's just like when you're fat and bald, they think you can't play music, or you know, I don't know. It's weird. So, but all that stuff really helps, and I found out that you learn better as we get older because we know how to learn. And so what used to take me 8 hours in the practice room now will take me an hour and a half or 2 hours, depending on the difficulty level of that kind of stuff. But let me show you something on Stella. For example, like the application of all that kind of stuff, because that's another part of playing that I think is really important. I don't practice anything that I can't use. I will never play through a Rubank etude. I never did, I never will. When I took lessons at the University of Miami, teacher gave me an assignment. I could read anything, so he gave me an assignment. I said, I'm not going to play that. Let's just play. I said, so we just played duets. We played pull-out duets. We played things like that. My classical saxophone teacher. And the other guys, I don't want to practice something just for the sake of being able to play something that's in a book that I can't use. It's ridiculous. Why? Why do we do that to people? How many of you teach? You know, it's really easy to give a student that, but what the hell are they going to do with it? Well, you know, you're going to learn about, no, if you're going to learn something, learn it using it in musical terms. I'll show you. For example, triads, right? If we're playing Stella, I know that every scale has built into it major, minor, and some form of not standard, either diminished or augmented or some kind of triad. For example, I'm going to play nothing but augmented triads on all these changes. But they're the augmented triads that are inside of the chord scales that fit for all of those chords. Right? And in some cases I have, like for example, on a minor 7 chord, you'll see a major 7, you'll see minor major 7. You'll hear a +5 on a dominant 7 chord, you might hear a +5 on a major chord. But I don't think anything will sound weird to us now, because thanks to all those guys who are hanging on the wall, they already did everything. So the rest of us are just trying to figure it out. But let me show you. 1, 2, 1. I could practice augmented triads all day. What for, if I can't use them? Now, in the case of Coltrane and these guys, you guys remember Like Someone in Love? He plays that line a lot. Jerry Bergonzi will play that stuff. So that's an application of a lot of stuff. Same thing with major triads and minor triads. Let's do the same thing, and I'll play a bunch of major triads. I want. Nothing but major triads. There just happen to be more than one for every single chord. Those of you who play jazz, you're like, yeah, I do that all the time, so you already know. But how many of you play triads all the time? You guys know what I'm talking about? Upper structure triads. They have all these fancy names for them in music school and all that kind of. These guys, they're obnoxious because they play chords from the very beginning. So they always make us feel inferior. You know, you play with piano players, right? And you play your solo and you're like, why do you play all the good notes? Because they have to. They know them all. They're also really good musicians. This guy, he knows every chord of every song. And unfortunately, the other thing they know is when we're dragging, when we're rushing, when we're out of tune, and when we don't know the changes. And the poor drummers, they go crazy because we pull the time back and forth, and most of the time we're so busy thinking about what we're going to play that we don't pay attention to them, and we forget to converse with them. So that's why sometimes playing fours and just practicing with a drummer is great because they make us play really differently. But so for me, I try not to practice anything unless I can use it in terms of the music. Let's try, for example, All the Things You Are. All right? And I'll just play a bunch of triads and a bunch of stuff like that. And then I'll also play some things with the drums. And I learned this from, there's a teacher at the University of Miami, Vince Maggio, great teacher. And he made me realize that saxophone players, we tend to have diarrhea of the chops. We just tend to play, guys, you guys know what it's like. You go to a jam session and you're like, another? You're going to play another chorus? And because we're nuts. As Charlie Parker said, if you play more than 4 choruses on anything, you're just practicing. You're not really playing music. But one of the things that Vince really made me conscious of was that if I change what I'm playing, the drummers tend to have an immediate reaction, and the whole band starts to sound better. It's amazing how that goes. So let's play this, and I'll try to do it. I'm sorry I gave it away, but I'll try to show it. Hopefully I remember how this tune goes. Remember, I speak Spanish, so I have to transpose English to Spanish. All the things you are. One, These guys sound great. They're great players. You're lucky to have these guys here. You get a chance to play with them? Some of you guys play with these folks? So you're pretty fortunate to do that. But you notice that the minute I stop playing, or the minute he leaves space, or the minute he leaves space, that all of a sudden there's room for him. What's your first name? Drew.
Yeah.
There you go. In Miami, it'd be like Jose or Juan, or, you know. Just kidding. But
Welcome to the Midwest.
probably playing a lot of Latin gigs too. But you know, all of a sudden, Drew has this space that wasn't there. And the really great part of our music is the communication stuff, and that's when you play with great players, when you're part of a group like this, and you sort of get to scope out where he's coming from, and you hear all the things that he's playing and kind of his influences, and then you start to check that out, and it starts to get into your playing, and vice versa. And that part of it is really great, and we tend to, in many respects, ignore the drums. We ignore that element because we very selfishly see them as someone who is responsible for just keeping time for us. And that really isn't the case. They're great musicians, and the idea is to communicate with them and to sort of learn their language. And so you see a lot of saxophone players, you know, Elvin and Train had that connection. And there's that great video on YouTube of Train practicing, what was he, 4? And Elvin's playing the pillows. They're like, he's just practicing playing the tune 4, and it's just him a cappella, and Elvin playing the pillows, and they're like practicing in the room. And that part of it is really important. So that was one of those things that I learned early on. And then playing with all the Latin percussionists, I have so much fun because those guys can turn, they can do so many things within a measure or a beat, and kind of displace where the accents are and then come and find them again. And that's kind of Joe Henderson is a master of that thing, that kind of rhythmic development thing. So there's all that element to learn. But you guys heard the triads, and you hear the major triads, you hear minor triads, you hear the augmented stuff and all that. And those sounds are already embedded inside of all the scales that we learn typically. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the website all the stuff that we talked about today. I'll put some sheets up. I didn't want to put them in advance because I don't know what we're going to talk about. But I'll put some stuff up for you guys to see where that stuff comes from, and then all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, I already do that, or I've been through that, but I hadn't done it in that particular way, or all that kind of stuff. But you see how much of it is really a mental exercise. I think once you get on the gig and you're just playing, if I wasn't playing for a bunch of saxophone players, it'd be different. But when you're in the shop kind of thing, it's different. Any questions? You guys have any? And pardon my dealing with reeds, and Miami's really different. So whenever I change positions, it's a little different. Yeah.
Not a question, but just to add what you were saying about that, one of my favorite quotes about drummers is, it should be your goal to make the drummer sound good.
Right.
From Monk said that.
Who said that? Monk said that?
Yeah.
That's great. And he was a master of that. Just all that space that is really important in the music. And as saxophone players, piano players, guitar players, notoriously bad about that, it's so easy for us to just sort of keep going. And eventually they just tune out. And it's a drag because there's something to be said about, it's one of the great things about all the R&B music and all the kind of the real soulful music is that it's all about groove. And so now all of a sudden it goes away from information and it goes back to, am I playing a pocket and am I playing for people to move their feet? And that really helps. I mean, that being a part of that kind of stuff. The only limitation there is that all of a sudden then you can be limited as to what notes you can play. You know, you have to be somewhat careful with. Sometimes you play some of those weird things and they look at you like, oh, he's a jazz musician. In some cities, that's a bad thing. Like if they say that about you in Nashville, or then modern Nashville's a little different, but if they say that about you in Nashville, that was not a compliment. Oh, you're a jazz musician. I was like, you play too many weird notes, or as Dizzy would say, funny notes. Questions or answers? Yeah.
Talk a little bit about practicing and harmonic development. Is there anything you can shed in terms of your rhythmic development, or things that you practice to develop a better rhythmic vocabulary?
I just use the for example, the Aebersold records and things like that. Now, you guys have that little app called iReal Book. You guys have that, and it does all the sequences for you when you're on your phone, so you can play along with it. It'll do it at different tempos and stuff like that. But one of the things that I practiced was like playing groups of notes, like trying to play 5 notes in a row, even if there were different rhythms, but like groups of 5, groups of 3, groups of 4, incorporating triplets. And in some cases, like I did it so much that it's actually something that I don't like about my playing sometimes, is that I'll play lines and I'll insert all these triplets in the middle of it, and it starts to get a little muddy. But it was just a thing about, like even on this tune, like, you know, one of the tendencies that we have is to play that idea of always making the line be non-predictable, so that you have some form of a rhythmic element in there that, in this case, a lot of triplet stuff, you know. And where it gets harder, I think, sometimes is when we start getting into 16th notes. We go into that double time mode, and now all of a sudden we forget that there are all these other factors there. So one of the things that I notice about great players is that they will break up double time lines either with some kind of rhythmic effect, some kind of space effect, or some kind of melodic effect. That's really good. And in terms of the melodic stuff, you know, there's the term melodic development, where you have that because we have to listen to ourselves. You know, when we're improvising, when you're having a really good day, in my case anyway, when I'm having a really good day, which is very rarely, I can see everything that I'm going to play and hear it before I play it. It's literally like it's written out for me. You're so zoned in that like everything you play is just, it's just already, your brain's like, you're going to do this. And it all makes sense because it's all locked in. But on the rest of the days, where it's like the other 365, it doesn't work that way. And so we have to listen to ourselves. And in my case, I suck. So I don't want to listen to myself because I know that everything I'm going to play, I'm going to hate. So when I listen to it, if I do that, then the next thing I'm going to do is go, ugh, right? But eventually you learn to just sort of ignore it and to try to tell a story from, like when you watch comedians and they do that improv stuff, you know, where somebody will just give them a card and it'll okay, go. And these people, they come up with these unbelievable stories and you're just rolling on the floor and they're making it up. But they're making it up because the last thing they said will then trigger some other response. And that's a really cool thing to practice for us in terms of melodic development. If you want a rhythmic development, I'm not sure anybody did it as well as Henderson, as Joe. Joe is you know, you try to transcribe a Joe Henderson solo, it's useless because it's so well done. And he's just building on what he just did, so he's never going to do the same thing again. And you're not going to do that because there's no way you're going to go. But the concept of it, you know, and you love, it's like if you listen to Henderson as a drummer, you probably love the way he plays, right? Because they're just like, they're drummers that are doing that kind of stuff. And so you sort of develop those kinds of things. I just, the greatest thing about playing the saxophone for me anyway, playing music, and the most frustrating thing about playing music, is that it's just never very good. I've never walked off a bandstand or a recording or anything where I felt like, oh, that was good, ever. And so that part of it is great because I know I have things to work on. You know, I'm always working on stuff. I'm driving my car. I drive my daughters nuts because I'll be like singing lines and fingering patterns while I'm driving on the steering wheel. And so you hear this like, and they'll hear this, they're like, what the hell are you doing? They want to hear Justin Bieber, and I'm like doing all these, you know. But that's just part of what we do. We're all like that. You guys are probably all walking around with all kinds of stuff in your head all the time, right? Your wife's talking to you, your husband's talking to you, and you're like completely not there. They're like, didn't you hear what I said? Yes, dear. No, I didn't hear a note. It's normal for us. So that part of it is really great. And just the fact that so many incredible musicians are still here, and there were so many before us, that there's so much stuff to learn. You know, transcribing is another thing. You guys do a lot of transcriptions and stuff like that. For those of you that do them, they're really helpful. It's like reading books. It really is reading books, but at a whole nother level. It's like reading books as the guy is telling you the story and you're writing it down. But not everything that's in a transcription is really important. They're great solos. For example, I love Coltrane solo on Like Someone in Love. If you look at that transcription, it's a map. And it's a map of how you build a perfect solo. I mean, it literally is a drawing, you know. So in that respect, yeah, that transcription, everything about that transcription is important because I'm looking at it as the whole. But every line and every phrase isn't necessarily what I want. And some solos, you only really need one particular thing. You're only looking for one really cool sound that they used. You know, Grossman on that Liebman, Dave Grossman and Dave Liebman, Steve Grossman and Dave Liebman did a record with Elvin Jones called Live at the Lighthouse, and it's got like every great New York tenor player lick on it, and so you like cop a bunch of that stuff and sort of you can sort of ring in. It's like being able to add some spice to your cooking, like, oh, here's a little Italian, here's a little Indian, here's a little... So this is like the New York tenor player thing. But not every line they play on that record is great. Only about 99.9%. And that book, by the way, you can buy that transcription nowadays. We had to do it by hand back when I was in school. We had to chisel. But Gene Pearl actually transcribed all that stuff, and they sell that, the Omni book, the Liebman Grossman Omni book. And there's that stuff. Same thing with the Coltrane solos. You guys know Andrew White? You know who that is? It's amazing. This guy, how many of you don't know who Andrew White is? Andrew White is probably one of the greatest musicians in the history of American music. He's this African-American guy who lives in Washington, D.C. He's a tenor player. He played bass for the Fifth Dimension. He played oboe for the National Symphony. Transcribed every solo that Coltrane ever played, and they're all perfect. This guy's, it's not perfect pitch. It's like, he's like from Mars, right? He's an older guy now, but he's probably the greatest musician that nobody's ever heard of. This guy is a genius. And so he has Andrew's Musical Enterprises. He's not online. You have to go find the stuff. It's in Washington, D.C. You can find the address online. But you ask for a catalog, he sends it to you. And you can actually order the Coltrane solos from all the records and all the bootlegs. And they're all, his handwriting is unbelievable. So you get these things, and they're all perfect. And he writes the changes out and all that kind of stuff. So you don't have to spend, in my case, lose your hair trying to transcribe Coltrane. You just go find Andrew White, and you buy those transcriptions. They're not expensive. They're like, one transcription might be like $3 or $4. And he doesn't buy records. So like, you want the entire Giant Steps album? Here's the thing. He sends them to you. He's an incredible person. I think he's one of those guys that deserves a Congressional Medal of Honor. You know, I'm gonna do a push for that and write like a petition and get him, because he's just a genius that no one knows he exists. And he plays unbelievably great. Plays like Coltrane. It's nuts. And he's in D.C. But so there's that with these guys know the Andrew White transcriptions because we played through a bunch of them at school. We all have them. And he's really smart. He makes them in a size where you can't really make a copy. The sizes, he's a genius, this guy. I think he has he writes it, and then the paper machine is like the kind that's all one roll of paper and then you fold it. So when you get the paper, he like folds it up. It's brilliant, but you'll want to check those out. I wish I had one here and show you, but they're awesome.
Perfect.
They're perfect. It's ridiculous. I mean, this guy's hearing is, you know, it shows you that God doesn't give us all the same stuff. Like, Andrew, here, and add your screw. But that's the way it goes. But all that stuff is there. And so when you look at those transcription things, there are just so many things that are so cool. Like, you know, for example, Bergonzi has this thing that I love that he does. Everybody plays this. Right, the diminished scale, and they play that pattern. But one of the really cool things that I learned from Bergonzi was that he figured out that inside of the diminished scale, there are 4 major triads and 4 minor triads. They're the same ones, right? So, and I'm starting the diminished scale in the traditional sense of that. But for example, in that scale we have. They're all there. Like if you play a B flat 13 flat 9. What Bergonzi does is he says, I'm going to play them both at the same time. So he plays major and minor at the same time, plays all 4 of them. So, for example, instead of, he plays it starting on the 3rd, and he goes. So you have, in the case of, how many tenor players are here? I'll do it in tenor key. You have C major and minor, E flat major and minor, F sharp major and minor, and A major and minor. But he plays them all starting on the major triad, but from the first inversion. So E is, if I'm going up, I'm playing E, G, C, E flat. And then G, B flat, E flat, G flat. A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, A. And then C sharp, E, A, C. You guys have all heard Brecker do that, right? He'll be playing like, let's play a B flat blues for a second. A 1, 2, a 1. I just keep changing it to whatever that chord is. These guys do that all the time. They're bored out of their mind. He's like, yeah, we do that already. But for saxophone players, we're handicapped. We play one note at a time. It's like tricycles. We have to put it together. These guys have a motorcycle. They're like, yeah. But it's just the way we learn it. But I learned stuff like that from those guys. So if I listen to that on a Bergonzi thing and I know it works on one chord, I just say, well, I'm going to learn it and use it on a million things. And so there's part of Bergonzi that's with me. There's part of Grossman that's with me. There's part of Coltrane. The bebop scale that. How many times does he play that in Giant Steps? A million times. Every time he plays it, it sounds great. It's like, yeah, it works, so I'm going to borrow that. And so that's a major scale with a half step in between the fifth and the sixth. Right, so it's got that extra little half step in between the fifth and the sixth. There's the other one, which we play a lot in the Mixolydian mode, or the dominant 7 chord, where you're playing a Mixolydian scale and you put a half step in between the root and the seventh of that chord. So, like for example, in that blues. And then you can use the bebop scale. And then all of a sudden I start playing all the Coltrane stuff, the Charlie Parker stuff from Confirmation over that thing, which all those guys do that. And you just start practicing those things in those particular settings. But the key really is to focus on how you can use that stuff in your music the next time you play. How many of you are playing regularly in a band, like a community band or a band or a gig or that kind of thing? If you're doing that, then you're getting a chance to play, even if it's once a week. You're getting a chance to apply that stuff. And what happens is that at first we have to force that information out. At first we have to kind of will it to occur. And it sounds forced. But again, talking with Michael, I asked him, we were in Japan hanging out, and I said, hey, when you practice something, when you're working on something, how long does it take before it shows up in your playing? And he said to me, 3 months. And I said to him, that's what I find the same thing. Almost everybody I talk to, it's 3 months from the time that you're working on something in the practice room and sort of forcing yourself to play it until it becomes part of your regular vocabulary, like learning a new word. At first you have to force it into something and then it becomes part of your. So it's a long process in terms of that, but it helps a lot when you force yourself. He said that Joey Calderazzo, he said, Joey's a little different. He said he could do it that same night. So everybody's some guys just have like Herbie, who's got a photographic memory, and if you burp, he tells you what chord it is, and it's not. Greg Fillinganes is the same way. There are a bunch of those guys, and when you're around them, you just learn that there's a lot of eating humble pie when you're a musician, because there are a lot of really brilliant people walking around the planet, and that's okay. They just make you better. Arturo's the same way. I always say that with Sandoval. If you give him a banana, music will come out. He's nuts. He's a great spirit. Coltrane was the same way. It didn't matter what he was doing, music was going to come out. But so there's a lot of examples of that. Other questions about stuff? Like, yes.
Are you a multi-instrument?
Yeah, I have to play a bunch of them. Well, as a saxophone player, we can't avoid playing the flute and the clarinet, whether we want to or not. So I have to play those and I have to work on them. And I end up having to play piano quite a bit, because when I'm making records and doing arrangements and stuff like that. So yeah, and I played Iwi and all that kind of stuff. As a kid, I played a lot of trumpet. I stopped doing it after a while, but I played a lot of trumpet as a kid, so I like that. I don't play bass or guitar or any of those things. I'm pretty allergic to the guitar. So I have I can't figure that one out. But you do the same thing. You're playing woodwinds and stuff.
Kind of flute.
Yeah. And for all of you guys who are playing music professionally or semi-professionally, you're probably having to play some woodwind at some point all the time, right? Doing shows or that kind of stuff. I think it's important, and it's hard because it takes up a lot of time. I just finished doing a whole record of woodwind stuff recently, and on the new album, the one that just came out, there's some clarinet. I played clarinet solos on other people's records, like for Gloria Stefan and for people like that, and I had never done it on my own record, and I thought, well, maybe it's time to play a clarinet record on the record, so a clarinet solo on the record, so I do that, and play flute on a lot of pop records, a lot of alto flute stuff, Latin music, Brazilian music. I like those instruments, and I had to study it in school. It's part of the kind of the requirement. But I like those instruments. They're very important, and in terms of writing, and in terms of playing, you want to have a soprano, and you want to change the colors. I find that I play those instruments differently anyway. They have a different personality. The tenor kind of is, for me, the tenor is more of a Ferrari or a racehorse, and the soprano is more of it has a different kind of gentleness about it. It's more melodic, more that kind of thing. I find that. Other questions or yes?
You're tone. You can adapt to any situation you're playing. Any thoughts on what you can tell us with that? What's your thought process when you do that? Like you play something, you have some of the jazz, you have the dark color,
Yeah.
some of the funk, where it really just.
To me, it's just for me, music my job has always been to serve whoever the artist is that I'm playing with at that time. So if I'm playing on sorry, this reed's going. Hold on a second. But if I'm doing that, if I'm playing on a club date, or if I'm playing a wedding, or which I've done, or I'm playing for my in-laws or something like that. That's just part of my job, and so I like Stan Getz. I like a lot of the older guys, a lot of that playing, and so there's that same thing with vibratos. There's that, and if you're playing in a section doing the vibrato thing in a swing tune, if I'm playing with old guys, I don't mean old chronologically. I mean guys who play older music, and I know that the lead alto player is going to do that. I have to find that pace, that vibrato pace, so I don't sound out of place. And the same thing happens with I'm just so influenced by rock and roll music and by pop music because I grew up with it, But having that kind of the growling sound or the bright sound or that kind of thing. And this is Eric's mouthpiece, so this is only the first time I've ever played it anywhere outside. I played it a little bit yesterday at the house. He just sent it to me, and it's really a great mouthpiece. Plays a lot. Those of you who play a link, it plays a lot like a link. I don't have the right reed for it and all that kind of stuff, and I'm also playing the Max Sax horn, which I play at home. I really like these horns. That's why I'm playing it. I left the house without my Mark 6, which I've never done, but it's just to show you that these are really great horns. You hear the scale on them is really good, and they're just great instruments. Thank God people are making great instruments again, because when we're trying to buy Selmers, they're so expensive. They're great, but they cost a lot of money. My wife yells at me. I think it's just about the music. In other words, I'm trying to play the music. I'm not trying to play the saxophone. And in terms of records, that question, I always answer this. When I go in a recording studio, my job is never to have somebody say, that's a great sax player. My job is to say, that's a great track. Now, if I can get lucky and do what I do and get away with it, that's great. But really, it's about making that artist sound good. I got a chance to record, there's a Christmas record with Vanessa Williams. And so I don't think I'm going to do a whole lot of, on a Vanessa Williams record. If I'm going to do it, it's going to be in a very, very subtle way. And so it just makes it's about that. But in terms of sound, the leadman said something to me not too long ago. We were playing somewhere, and I hurt my diaphragm. I actually have a. We were talking about this on the way here, but I ruptured my diaphragm. You know, it's like a little elevator that holds the air. I blew a hole through it playing with Sandoval at the Blue Note. Michael Brecker blew a hole through his larynx here, this tissue here. That's why he wore that brace. It's the same hernia. It's a hernia of the diaphragm or a hernia of the throat. So when that happened, it had a tremendous impact on me, and it was very negative for a long time. I had really struggled with the air stuff, and I saw Lehman, and we were playing somewhere, and I said to Lehman, I said, man, I'm really struggling with the air thing, and he said, well, it doesn't sound like it. He said, but remember that it's all about the overtones, and sure enough, whenever I get really bugged about my playing, the first thing that I'll go through is this. The minute you start playing overtones, your whole sound opens up. Everything just starts to go through the right way. And so I'll do things like. Because if I don't go through that process, the sound starts to get smaller and smaller, and you start to constrict all this stuff. It's a very physical thing. So for me, that really helps. And then just listening to a lot of different musicians. There are a lot of great saxophone players, and so I listen to all of them, and there are things that I can borrow from all of them, or from most of them. There are some things that I don't like, and I don't use them. There are some kinds of sounds that I don't like. Like for example, I usually play a metal mouthpiece on the tenor, primarily because I play with very loud rhythm sections. This wasn't the case today, but I play with people who play really loud, so it helps to generate. But I also need the ability to scream when I need it, that I can't get out of a rubber mouthpiece. On the soprano, it's different. The soprano is, I don't have to scream, so it's a different. I don't have to play quite as much altissimo stuff or that kind of thing. Another question? I guess we could. Yeah, go ahead.
Another question for Glenn. Would you mind showing off your versatility if there's a common theme you guys all know, like R&B or Motown or
Oh my God.
Harris
Oh my God.
Giant Steps is a Motown.
That they asked Stanley Turrentine did that. Let's do Giant Steps like that. 1, 2, I want. Are just a little different.
Yeah.
You know, but it's more about intent, I think, than it is about anything else. And also in the R&B stuff, you really have to play a lot more rhythmic stuff and a lot more kind of melodic kind of stuff. That's a particularly hard one to do. But for example, let's do Green Dolphin Street. Here, I start. whatever it is, you know. I listen to so many different things, and I'm influenced by so many different things that it almost can get silly in that respect. I can some of the jazz guys will get mad at you if you're playing kind of more of a R&B thing on a jazz tune or that kind of thing, but it is what it is. You know, it's you're going to play music that you want to play, and for me, I don't ever want to play it the same way twice, so I'm trying to kind of fight those things that way. It's a lot of fun. Other questions? Yes.
You got some effects on the harp, some of the split tones and things.
Oh, there's a lot of stuff. There's all the double stop stuff is really cool. All this all that stuff is really cool. The and that's just a matter of finding the alternate fingerings for all those notes. The hardest ones are the ones that most people don't know are middle E, this one. Now this one's a little flat. That key opens a little too far, but so I play E, and if you have a newer horn that has a bigger tone hole, you play the third, the high F key, this key, and you play the high E key, and that gives you middle E. Just those. So those are really cool, and what's nice about those is that you can generate rhythmic patterns without having to do a lot of tonguing stuff that sometimes gets in your way. Split notes happen in two ways. I don't know if I can do it on this horn because I just have to learn them. You know, you have to learn the horns. But like for example. If I play high G and I sort of don't play it quite as hard, the note will want to crack. But if I control it that way, I get that multiphonic that way. And then multiphonic, there are a bunch of books on the multiphonics. I know a few of them, but I don't know a lot of them because I only use them in very specific instances. But there are quite a few books on that kind of stuff, and it's just sets of patterns that'll give you some, 2, 3 note sequences, and then the key is to try to find places where they work harmonically with the stuff that you're doing. There's that. The growl stuff, I just try to either sing the note, that part of it is. that really is hard on your reeds, because the reeds vibrate a lot when that happens. So you'll find that if you're doing that a lot on a set, your reed will kind of crap out in the middle of the set because it just can't. It's being abused. So that part of it is there. And then with the tonguing stuff, I just do all the stuff that the trumpet players and the brass players, and all that stuff really works well. It just takes time to practice it. Like, you'll hear some stuff on the PALO records. You'll hear a lot of it. The new PALO record has some stuff that's pretty cool that way. I use it as part of lines, not as an effect. There's something on the 360 record. There's at the end of the tune. There's a line that gets done that way, and I just sort of. It's just one of those things that saxophone players haven't done. They haven't really double tongued or triple tongued, doing that kind of stuff. Flute players do it, but saxophone players haven't done it. It's like, why? We can do anything they can do. We can do it better. It's the world of the non-Euclidean world. That concept that you can't do something or that is wrong, and the idea that we don't have alternatives to things is really quite incorrect.
So, is it possible to play lower than a B flat on your guitar?
Well, if I put my foot in the bell and all that kind of stuff, yeah, but not very effectively. I literally have to go try to put my foot in the bell and do all that kind of stuff. So I'm pretty stuck there. I can play that B flat flat, but it's not very good sounding. I always tell my students I teach music business at a community college, the largest community college in America, and I always tell them that if I can't do anything else for a living, I could go work at the Port of Miami. Yeah, ring a ship. That's about all it's good for. But that part of the horn is great. I use it more for things like launching points, I use them as kind of places to launch myself from when I'm doing all those kind of crazy lines and entrances and things that are sheets of sound kind of things. I use that. I'm not a big fan. I use the lower register a lot when I'm doing all these. All that kind of stuff. That's fun, but that's different.
On the subtones that you do, are you using a flat tone to muffle it?
I just do it just like the brass players. Taka, 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 taka.
I'm talking about subtone.
Oh, on the subtone. No, I just have I think my lip just kind of, my jaw just comes back a little bit on the mouthpiece.
Is your teeth on top?
Oh yeah, always. Yeah. But I think it's just the jaw coming back. I think Eric sent me
That's a 7.
it's a 7. So usually I play the equivalent of a Link 7 or a 6 star, something like that. So it's not particularly open. The reed's pretty hard. This reed is like a 4, but it's just, I play with a lot of resistance and stuff. But I'm not a big mouthpiece person, because I think that the pitch starts to get really funny on them. You either have to play a soft reed or there's a lot of room for error there. And so I find that the smaller tip openings are a little more manageable, for me anyway. Some guys like playing big mouthpieces. On the West Coast, it's a very popular thing. Los Angeles, California, places like that, they tend to play a little more open. Some of the Texas guys will play that kind of thing. I come more from a New York kind of school. People are playing smaller setups. But the subtone thing, I think, is more about bringing your jaw back a little bit, and also I think the air sort of gets pointed down some, as opposed to going straight in or going up. I think the air is coming down towards the reed a little bit, and that tends to help get that sound. It's something that I use all the time. I mean, I play. I've never been a big fan of that sound. You know, I hate that. It's like that's a lawnmower. You know, I just don't like that sound, and so. I like that sound. It's kind of that. It's a pretty saxophone sound. The Getz thing, not the marching band. And I think it's because I play the upper register the same way I play the low register. The thing doesn't change very much. Sometimes when we're playing down low, we sort of pinch and we put more mouthpiece in your mouth, and we sort of like get under it and blow up and do all kinds of weird things that I just don't think they sound very good. That's not to say on the alto, for example, I like some of that sound down low. Sanborn does it beautifully. It's a pretty sound. Some of the legit stuff, if you have the right setup and all that kind of stuff, is very pretty. But I use it in a very different context. For me, the music is different. Other question? You guys want to play a little bit of Body and Soul? I'm sorry I talk so much. Let's see that. Sorry about that. The reed is giving up, but the horn plays great. The mouthpiece plays great. But those are you have to get really comfortable with that part of the setup on it, because all the horns are different. They all respond a little different in that break area. But you know, there's all the melodic development stuff was there, the rhythmic stuff, the pentatonic stuff. I'm just trying to play through some of the same things that we're talking about, so that you hear kind of those things in application, and you know, I guess then the key is then to forget all that stuff when you go to play it.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to look at. I was going to analyze what you were doing and solo and those spots.
I don't know if I can remember some of the stuff, but I know that there's a lot of the stuff that we talked about today was in there. So it's, you know, and I'm doing it on purpose, trying to get that stuff so you guys see it in application mode.
Can you just start out like the first word was, what you were thinking?
That's all just melody stuff, you know, except that it's melody stuff where you have to change the pattern based on whatever that scale is. That, by the way, practicing in terms of that, one of the best practicing things is to practice with just a metronome and nothing else, and really have to force yourself to play all those changes. You know, I think that's the real pretty part of that, which these guys get a chance to do, because they have such a handle on the harmony, and they can also accompany themselves. But for us, that becomes a really important thing. So it isn't just not only the guide tones and finding the kind of the color tones, but just being able to outline that whole change. I do that a lot, like when I'm in hotel rooms, when I'm out on tour and stuff like that. I'll just get a metronome, and I'll go in the bathroom, and I'll kind of close the door with some towels so people can't hear what I'm doing, because otherwise it's pretty weird. And I'll just play on one tune for a while, and just try different approaches on that stuff. There's another really cool thing about, well, it comes from the pentatonic scale, from the regular diatonic pentatonic scale, but that pentatonic scale, because it's set up in perfect fifths, there are actually 3 of them that are happening at the same time. There are 3 pentatonic scales happening, and when you put them together, like for example, if you played B flat minor, I'll show you what I mean. There are 5 groups of major second and fourth, or major second and fifth from the first note. All the notes have that relationship, like on any pentatonic scale. So you have 1, 2, and 5. They're all perfect, and they all build on each other. And what happens is that all of them work over a minor chord or a major chord. Like for example, in Green Dolphin Street. Let's play that for a second. I'll show you what I mean. A one, two. Start to hear how they're all these structures are inside of that stuff, and so it's up to us to find where they are, and then to apply them. And it's interesting because, like for example, pentatonics are really good in terms of they work great as fourths. But they work really cool as fifths. So if I wanted to on that tune, 1, 2, I want. All I'm doing is taking the pentatonics, it's insane, but taking the pentatonics and just making them fifths. What's really cool about that is trumpet players play fourths really well, but they don't play fifths very well. So when they stick it to us by playing a fourth, I stick it back to them by playing a fifth. It's like, go ahead, now go do that. I do it with Arturo. Arturo and I have this thing where it's this constant like war. You know, it's a friendly war, but it's like, and then I'm like, yeah, and it's like, yeah, and it goes back and forth. But it's things that lay well on the trumpet don't necessarily lay well on the saxophone, and things that lay well on the saxophone usually don't lay well on anything. So but what it does is it really gives you very different approaches to playing. You guys ever have a thing where you go to play and you're like sick of the way you play by the end of the first song? Or before you even start, you're like, oh, I'm going to play the same crap I always play. And so one of the ways that you fight that is you say, okay, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to play pentatonics on this chorus, or I'm going to play nothing but rhythmic ideas on this chorus, or I'm just going to play with the drummer. Who cares about what the notes are? Or I'm going to play nothing but sixths. You know, like, let's play for a second Days of Wine and Roses. Right? Great tune. The melody with a sixth, and then all of a sudden you start to hear them going up and you start to hear them going down, and then it's like, okay, I played so many intervals that now I want to play some lines that are steps. And I always find that when you find really great songs, really beautiful standards, they all have these pretty like linear things and then a skip, and then there's a pretty linear thing and then a skip, or vice versa. There's a skip and then a pretty little linear thing, because it's that kind of, it's like when you're talking to somebody and they're telling you a story and it's all of a sudden And that's the beauty of that really romantic music. And those intervals, the sixths, the sevenths, the fifths to some degree, but sixths and sevenths in particular, are so powerful in that way because they're built in to be romantic. Runes like Caper with the sevenths. You have some kind of a step and a seventh or a step and a sixth, and you don't have to do a whole lot after that. You have to stop because whatever else you're going to play after that isn't going to be as pretty. So there are all these little tricks that, but I sure wish I knew. I wish I had more time to do it and I knew more. But there's a lot of stuff. There's just a lot of stuff that we can work on. And so in terms of keeping the playing fresh, so that you're not bored with your own playing, you just approach it from that perspective. It can be as simple as saying, I want to play this sort of the way Joe would play it. You know, like drive to the gig listening to Joe Henderson, and then play everything trying to do that. Not trying to copy the notes, not just the vibe, like sort of stepping in his shoes for a minute, or trying to play like Coltrane, or trying to play like Phil Woods, or trying to play like Sonny, or that kind of stuff. It's wonderful. It's a great exercise, like out of body, forcing ourselves to be in positions where we're not normally comfortable and stuff like that.
It's funny you mentioned that. We just had in the shop a couple days ago, Sam Marlin was here, who's Harold Arlen's son. And he said he grew up with his dad and he was around his dad all the time with all these great players. And he would always ask his dad, how do you write such great melodies? And exactly what you just said was, he said, you find a skip that even if it's an octave,
Right.
somewhere over the
Yes.
rainbow, or it's only a paper moon.
Yes.
And then you
Yes.
play a melody from there, and it's unexpected, and then it's pretty. He said
Yeah,
that was his dad's trick.
Man, those melodies, those octave things are so powerful, especially when great singers like, I love Barbra Streisand and the great singers, but I'm not sure that there's anybody that sings as well as that. She's pretty magnificent, and I hear her sing an octave, and it's just every hair on your body stands up. The few that I have left, it's unbelievable, and you're like, I know that that's an octave, but there's the whole timbre change and the whole the portamento thing and so we're trying to do that. That tune, octave, and then it's got the sixth, and you just like, it's over. Right at that point you realize like, oh, yeah, that guy figured it out. And it's just beautiful. And then the bridge has got that little third thing, and the second thing, you're closing that interval, and it becomes so powerful. And in our solos, that stuff really helps. There's another couple of things that are really cool. Forcing yourselves to play a solo within a certain range of your horn, like a fourth. For example, what's the one we were just doing? Let's do that. I'm gonna play like in here. A fourth, which is hard. 1 and 2. I want. Rhythm, and you're going to have to use space, and you're going to have to change those guys up. And I had a Vince Maggio in our improv class, in our senior improv class. He made us do that, and then for the final exam, he made us do it within a major third. He had us play blues in 12 keys, and he made us play it in a major third. Like, if you played outside the major third, he was going to flunk you. Because he didn't want a bunch of scale running. He wanted you to play melodies and rhythms and stuff like that. And man, you talk about learning, and you talk about being humble, and you talk about getting your lunch handed to you. that's when it happens, because all of a sudden you realize, like, what am I gonna do with these 4 notes? And there are some people that have done some incredible things with 4 notes. So you have to then all of a sudden try to be one of them. It's pretty cool. Other questions? I know we've talked a lot. My clinic should be sponsored by Bayer, aspirin, because it's a lot of information. But yeah, go ahead.
I just got one more question.
Go ahead.
Because I wonder how many gigs you played that you just listened to the drummer and didn't think about the notes.
Actually, believe it or not, quite a few. I've done a lot of, first of all, a lot of free jazz gigs where it's just like about blowing. You guys know who Lonnie Liston Smith is? Dr. Lonnie Smith. I played a lot with Lonnie in Fort Lauderdale. And Lonnie's the kind of guy that will get up on a stage. I do this all the time. I never count off tunes. He'll just start playing. And you have no idea what the hell he's doing. Because he doesn't have any idea what the hell he's doing. He just starts and he'll sit for a while, and then all of a sudden it's off to some bizarre place and changes of meter and changes of time. And that's a great education. And at that point, you can't think anymore. That point just becomes playing music and reacting. And that's really fun, And also, when you're playing with great players and you're paying attention to what they're doing, they really influence your playing. I play with a couple of piano players in Miami who are really good at playing the Latin tumbao stuff and all that kind of stuff. And so that vocabulary has kind of gotten into playing. There's a violinist that I play with that has kind of that old, traditional, grappelli kind of thing. And so I've learned a bunch of things with him with turns and things like that are really cool. I play with a piano player who's very influenced in classical music. So he'll play a lot of these. And all of a sudden I'm playing in bands like PALO and doing mambos and stuff like that, and making mambos up, and I'll use those ideas to incorporate it into that thing. So there's a lot to be said for that. But I'm not always thinking. I wish I was. I wish I had a chance to think more. But I love practicing for that reason, is because I get a chance to just sort of hone in on ideas and do that. And I also love the studio for that reason, because I have a studio at home, and a lot of people will send me a track, and I'll say, like, send me a solo, and I'll send them like 4 or 5 different solos, and they'll all be completely different. And they're like, well, I don't know which one to pick. I'm like, hey man, that's not my problem. That's your problem. My thing was, I'm using this to learn. There are 3 records here, by the way. I run them because I have to put kids through college. But Mamblue, and it's actually marked on there, won a Latin Grammy Award. It's a double album, and it's just some really wild Latin jazz, big band music. I wouldn't say it if it wasn't true. It is a great record. Anybody that's heard it. When it won the Latin Grammy, the other people in the category were Chick Corea, Kenny G, a guy who won 2 Academy Awards for composition, and a piano player from Brazil. And not because it's my record, but it's an infinitely better record. Any of you that have heard it know that's the real thing. And it's got about 110 of the best musicians in the history of Miami. Arturo's on there. Everybody's on there. It's crazy. That's a great record. The new one, 360, is there, and that's really a jazz record. I felt like it was time to do a straight ahead record. I just wrote all the tunes myself because I don't want to pay anybody royalties for that kind of stuff. Any of you make records? You know that if you record other people's music, you have to pay them the 9.1 cents, or in jazz it's usually a little more because they're longer. And I just, if I really want to make a standards record, I'll do that. So I write my own stuff. Not just for the money too, it's because I get a chance to work on specific things. Like one of the tunes is at 360 BPM. That's why the title is 360. And there's a bunch of stuff on there with Coltrane changes and things like that are, as part of standards. And the other one's a tribute to the Santana record. So if you guys want to buy those, we'll make some kind of really good price for you guys. So you can take those home. But they're very good records. There's some great players on that stuff. But I use all the music. For me, is about learning. I don't make a record to play something that I know. I make a record to learn something. So usually when I'm recording stuff, I'm sight reading this stuff. When I did the stuff for example, if any of you have heard, I Remember Clifford, the Arturo Sandoval record, that solo on Joy Spring, I was sight reading. I just walked in the studio and played that and left. In a lot of cases, I don't practice a lot. I don't learn a lot of tunes. I know a few, but I don't learn a lot of jazz tunes because I feel like I'd rather work on my own stuff, and I'd rather work on the parts, the internal parts, the sequences, the 3-6-2-5s or the chord progressions, or the things that are general to everything, and then you can sort of hear your way through whatever the other stuff is. Any other questions? I'll make sure that I put some of this stuff up online, so I'll give you a link to the website. It'll be edcalle.com, but I'll put a bunch of this information up there so you guys have it, and hopefully it'll be stuff that you can use. You know, I hope that it's not so insane that you're like, I don't, hope there's something that you can use from it. And it's, we're all in this together, you know, we're all saxophone players, we're all trying to learn, I've never played with anybody or hung out with anybody that wasn't always in learning mode. Michael being a perfect example of that, Sandoval being a perfect example of that. I toured with Steve Winwood and Tito Puente. We did this thing in Europe with Arturo, and we're 7 of us. And one night, just to show you how musicians are, how great musicians are, one night I get a knock on my door, and I open the door, and it's Steve Winwood, you know, who I've been playing with for weeks. We've been on a bus together and doing all that stuff. And Steve had us over his house. Steve lives in a castle outside of London, a Roman castle. The guy's had a hit every decade, like 5-6 decades in a row. He's had a #1 hit. One of the greatest musicians you'll ever meet in your life. He knocks on my door and he says, "Hey, you know we were playing that tune today, that thing in F minor?" And it's like, "Yeah." And I'm nervous, you know. Like, "What did you play on that?" And I looked at him like, "Are you insane?" Like, first of all, I listened to Higher Love so many times that I actually put a hole through the CD. You know, the laser actually went through the CD. And here's a guy who plays organ and guitar and sings and he's still singing in the original keys. And he's asking me what I played because I guess he wanted, and then the next day he's playing the crap on the organ. And I'm like, that's a musician. So everybody that I've ever worked with, they're all the same. They're all like that. They're all just constantly learning something. And you know, I'm the same way with them. I'm checking out guitar players and try to figure out how they get all that power out of their solos and the bends and all that. You know, guitar players are really good at all this. They do all those 6 things so easily. For us, it's much harder, but it's a great effect. And so you just learn all that stuff. Any other questions or answers? Or it was fun. I hope it was good for you guys. It was fun for me. Thank you.